I'm going to give you an example of this. I don't know if anyone's heard of the creation story from the Bakuba kingdom in the Congo, but their creation story goes like this. There was originally a white giant named Mombo, and Mombo had a sharp pain in his belly and vomited up the stars and the moon and the earth. I'm not making this up. And then he was not over his illness. He had another pain in his belly and vomited again, and this time produced the people and the animals and the trees. And included in this second ejection was, and I quote, the leopard, the eagle, the anvil, woman, the monkey fumu, firmament, medicine, man, and lightning. So, if you find the creation story of the Bakuba kingdom an unlikely explanation for how we actually got here, just consider that if you were of the Bakuba kingdom, you would look at the Western story of the naked couple and the talking snake and the prohibited produce. And you would find that equally bizarre, right? And if you were Bakuba and you were living in Kansas, you would be fighting to put this in your children's textbooks. Right? So, I'm not suggesting that the story of Adam and Eve is suspect because there are competing stories. I'm suggesting it is suspect because the available scientific evidence weighs so strongly against it. So, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old by the best of our estimates now. The biblical account says it's 6,000 years old. Well, that's a problem because it has to account for why the Japanese were making pottery and the Magdalenians were painting cave paintings and the Persians were domesticating goats 4,000 years before the planet existed. So there are problems here, and I think that we could sort of safely say that we know maybe too little to commit to strict atheism, but we know way too much to commit to any particular religious story. So that puts me somewhere in the middle. And what has surprised me is the amount of certainty that you find when you walk into a bookstore. So I walk in and I find the books by the neo-atheists and the books by the fundamentally religious, and those are your only choices. And what happens is these are very smart people on both sides that are spending all of their energies polarizing each other and arguing against each other's details. And I feel like there should be another voice in there somewhere, because in fact, if you imagine the space of possibilities, it's enormous, right? I mean, you've got all sorts of possibilities for what might be going on. So imagine this space, and take the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. That's one point in this possibility space. And take the Eastern religions. That's another point in the possibility space. And take the idea that we're just atoms, and when we die, we shut off and we scatter. That's another point in the possibility space. And if you start populating this, you see that there are giant landscapes in between of possible stories that might be going on. And I feel like there's not enough discussion about this. Instead, there's this false dichotomy about God versus no God, which I think is much too limited, really, for a modern discussion. So for myself, I'm finding myself in this middle position. Now, some people call that agnosticism, which is a term that I think is sort of a weak term, because the way that it's typically used, people mean, well, I'm not certain if the guy with the beard on the cloud exists or doesn't exist. That's typically what they mean. They mean whatever was poured into my head, I have my doubts about it. So I don't call myself an agnostic. I call myself a possibilian. And the idea with possibilianism is an active exploration poured into my head. I have my doubts about it. So I don't call myself an agnostic. I call myself a possibilian. And the idea with possibilianism is an active exploration of this giant space, trying to make up new narratives and figure out new stories rather than getting caught in this false dichotomy. So possibilianism is now 1 year old. And I first announced it in a live interview on NPR a year ago, and I defined it and talked about it. And I left the studio and I got in my truck and I drove back to my laboratory at Baylor College of Medicine. And I settled in for a day's work, and I opened my inbox, And I had hundreds of emails from people saying, hey, I think I'm a possibilian too. So I Googled the word, and it turned out that it didn't exist. There were 0 hits. So I did what anybody would do. I bought Possibilian.com, and then I waited and watched to see what happened. Well, what happened was amazing. What happened was Facebook groups started and went all over the blogosphere. There were articles published by the New York Times and MSNBC. The Uganda Sunday Times just published a huge article on Possibilianism. It's gone all over the world. If you now Google, there are 10,000 hits, and it's really caught on in some way. It's really caught fire. Now, one thing I noticed, on the radio I said possibilian, but people misheard or misremembered, so other groups started popping up too. They called themselves possibilitarians or probabilians, and they spelled it any way you could imagine. And I thought, you know what, that's perfect. That's right in the possibilian spirit. Spell it any way you want to. So the thing I started wondering about is, why? Why has this caught on as a worldwide movement? Because keep in mind, it's a joke movement, right? We specifically don't subscribe to anything, so why is this catching on? And I think it's because maybe people are getting a little bit tired of the debates between Dawkins and the Discovery Institute. Maybe people are getting a little bit tired of the certainty that is proposed about topics that one can't possibly be certain on. So Voltaire said, doubt is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd position. So I think that maybe it's the time when there's just the right groundswell for this sort of idea. Now I want to clarify a couple of points about possibilianism. Sometimes when I talk about this, people will say, hey, that's terrific, that possibilianism is about anything goes. And I'm so glad that you're a possibilian, because then you get what I'm talking about with ESP or crystals or whatever. It's not anything goes. It's anything goes at first. And then what we do is we import the tools of science, right? So it would be terrific if ESP existed. We'd all love that. But to the extent that we're currently able to do it, we've tested these sorts of things and can't find any evidence to weigh in favor of it. So possibilianism, you can actually take the tools of science and rigorously try to rule out parts of the possibility space, as well as open up new parts of the possibility space. And really the interesting part of the possibilium comes where science leaves off, where we're no longer able to test things, and instead we're at the point that's beyond science's toolbox. That's really the interesting part of the possibility space. And I think the reason that we know that we need to be creative and come up with new narratives and have tolerance for multiple ideas is because there is so much that we're missing, and we're aware of the amount that we're missing. So in every generation, scientists have always felt that they sort of have all the pieces of the puzzle. Okay, well, we can take Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics and quantum mechanics, we can put it all together, we've sort of got all the pieces, we should be able to get it all from here. But it has never, ever been true in the history of humankind yet that we've had all the puzzle pieces. So just imagine trying to understand something like the Northern Lights before you understand what the magnetosphere is, or how muscles work before you understand the concept of electricity, or how the heart works before the concept of a pump was understood. You would make theories, you would have all kinds of ideas, but they would be doomed to be incorrect. And we know that's the situation we're in. First of all, there's all the stuff that we don't even know we don't know. But the thing I want to emphasize is that there's a lot that we know for sure we don't know. So take for example the concept of dark matter. So what happens is astrophysicists look out in the sky and they look at the gravitational pull of everything they can see, and they figure out where everything's supposed to be going. And it turns out the equations don't quite work out. And so there's this fudge factor of dark matter where you say, well, in order for the equations to work out, we're going to assume that there's something out there that we can't detect in any way. We just can't see it. We don't know what it is, but it must be there, and it's causing all this gravitational pull that we can't account for. But it's not a fudge factor exactly. 90% of the known universe is what we call dark matter. So what this means is we're sweeping a lot under the rug. We know that there's a lot we don't understand. And what I study every day when I go into the lab is this. This is the human brain. It's 3 pounds. It's the most complex thing we have ever found in the universe. It's made of hundreds of billions of pieces and parts. They are connected in such density that if you took a little cubic millimeter of brain tissue, there are more stars in there than there are more connections than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's an incredibly complex system, and yet somehow this wet biological network is you. It's all your hopes and aspirations and dreams, every piece of love you've ever felt, hunger, joy, everything. This is you. And the reason we know this is because if you lose a part of your pinky, you're no different, right? But if you lose a piece of brain tissue of that size, you're a completely different person. It changes you. It changes your conscious state. It changes who you are. So we know that somehow you are this thing, but what we do not know is how to take mechanical pieces and parts and build it in such a way so that there's private subjective experience. If I gave you a trillion Tinker Toys and I said, okay, put them together so this turns that and that, right? At what point do you add one more Tinker Toy and say, okay, now it's experiencing the taste of feta cheese? So the issue is, not only do we don't have a theory of how the brain works, we don't even know what such a theory would look like. Because we don't have the tools to say, okay, if you carry the 2 and you do a triple integral here, that equals the redness of red or the feeling of pain, right? We don't know how to make that translation. So these are the sorts of things that we know we don't know. Okay, so I think all of this calls for a little bit of intellectual humility. So I was giving a talk on Possibilianism not so long ago, and a guy came up to me afterwards and he said, good job, Dr. Eagleman. He said, you know what, you should be a politician. Because you're avoiding committing to anything. That's a great job for a politician. And what he said was, you know what, you should just cowboy up and commit to some position. So I thought, wow, well that's a really strange idea, right? It's a lovely expression that we have in this part of the country about cowboying up, which means making a firm decision. And we all admire this sort of thing. And I think it's really, it's a great trait if you are making a decision about, am I going to take the cattle out in this storm, or am I going to marry this woman, or am I going to sell the ranch? We admire people who make firm decisions. But what I'm going to suggest is that there are some domains where it's appropriate to do that, and some where there aren't. So my question to you is, would you ask the Marlboro Man what his opinion is on the possibility of extraterrestrial civilizations? Would you ask him over, say, an astrobiologist? And if you wouldn't, that suggests that there's a certain domain where it's appropriate to cowboy up and make a firm decision, and there's other domains where it's appropriate to not commit to a particular idea if in the complete absence of evidence to do so. So I'm going to suggest that the next time somebody says, well, you should just cowboy up and commit to a decision, we can say, you know what I'd rather do is geek out. And the idea with geeking out is I'm going to be creative and come up with new narratives. I'm going to be comfortable holding multiple possibilities in mind. And if you're going to geek out, you should feel free to cite the gospel of science, to tell the 3 words that are the most important 3 words that science ever gave to humankind. So my message to you is to go back out in the world today and be comfortable with the idea of holding multiple hypotheses in mind. And this is not just a plea for simple open-mindedness. It's actually a plea for an active exploration of new parts of the possibility space. Because I think this is really important for our educational systems, for our children, and for our legislation. And it's even important for our future of warfare against other peoples of arbitrary deities and cultures against whom we have historically been willing to take up arms, right? So my plea is to leave this auditorium today and go back into this strange, mysterious world that we're in and try to lead a life that is free from dogma and full of awe and wonder, and to celebrate possibility and to praise uncertainty. Thank you very much.